Hi all, let's have a look at game 2 of the World Chess Championship. So Sergey playing white in this game, e4, Magnus plays e5, and we go into the classic lopez, tried and tested. The arm wrestling around e5 is evident here. The little trick a6 is played here. Black is not losing a pawn. Just for those new to chess, I'll just quickly show you that this move is possible. It's one of the most important tricks in opening theory. If bishop takes c6 with the idea of winning a pawn, then there's queen d4 here hitting the knight, unprotected piece, and the pawn on e4. And actually black ends up being slightly better here because of the bishop pair. Yeah, that's to be avoided, that continuation. But bishop takes c6 with better continuations is perfectly okay, the exchange royal pairs. But we don't get that, we get bishop a4, which keeps more tension in the possession. Knight f6, that's the most common move. This is the most frequent as well. Bishop e7. d3, quite often in this position, either rook e1 or the delayed bishop takes c6 is played. d3 actually does mean bishop takes c6 is threatened. This is now on. Black cannot rely on the trick mentioned just before. So black has to do something about this forcing sequence because the e-pawn is protected here, and plays b5. That's the most common move played. Bishop b3. d6. This provides extra support for e5, which frees up the knight really for knight a5. So that now represents a threat to be parried. And white plays now a3, giving the bishop a2. Also quite common in this position, c3 or a4, not c4, but c3 gives c2 for the bishop, or a4. But we see here, okay, we see a3. Now black castles, knight c3. This is the most popular move in this position, keeping a control of the d5 square. A little bit of a clamp. Knight a5, not just hitting the bishop, but liberates the c-pawn. Bishop a2, white preserving the bishop, of course. c5 is not immediately played here. We see actually bishop e6. Black does not mind the double pawns in this position. There'll be some f-file pressure, and it would help secure the d5 square. Nevertheless, bishop takes e6 is the most frequently played move to test this concept, essentially. And there have been some magnificent games. One very high level clash with this kind of idea. Caruana against Levon Aronian, who's a major exponent of this type of system, where Caruana later sacked a piece actually, spectacularly. It's on the channel. But here we don't see the bishop takes e6 test. White just plays d4. Yeah, d4. Which has some benefits as well, but maybe not as exciting as bishop takes e6. So we see bishop takes a2. This is following though the game Caruana against Aronian. Yeah, a different game variation between the two top super GMs. So here rook takes a2. In fact, in this position, this quirky move is not to be totally ruled out. It's a little trap. If you're interested, a diabolical one. Can you see after knight takes e1, knight takes e4, there's a diabolical trap here set. What can white play in this position? If I give you 5 seconds. Okay. Queen e1 hits a5 and e4. So that would just be winning a piece. But also, you know, it is useful potentially for knight b4, so it's not just the trap setter. But it's not really doing that much to worry about for black anyway. So rook takes a2. You might think this is a quirky looking rook in any case. What's the rook doing on a2? At the moment, also you might think, isn't the e-pawn vulnerable? Black actually plays rook e8. He doesn't have to, and it's perhaps best not to do this because it facilitates a knight coming to f5 quite quickly like this. This would actually be really quite unpleasant for black to have this position, even though you might think there's e-file pressure. Overall, it's very unpleasant compared to more solid ways of playing the position. Yeah, it's trying to play for piece activity at the expense of letting white's pieces into aggressive squares, basically. So this move, rook e8, is much more solid. We have now rook a1. Now you might think, well, can white try and do something with this e5 pawn instead of rook a1? If he plays d takes e5, d takes e5, let's test this for a moment with knight takes e5. There's takes and bishop d6, and black is just going to get back the pawn. Simple as that. And there's a few variations here to consider. What about taking on d8 first? But they're all pretty harmless for black. Bishop takes d8 simply protects e5. Yeah, it's no big deal, it seems. So rook a1 keeps the tension, the central tension, going. Another interesting possibility, though, is this knight, once it seems the c4 square is marked by the pawn. You might think b3, and that actually does carry the benefit of letting white fianchetto the bishop here, which could be useful for e5 pressure. Let's have a quick look at this as well. So say c5, this would be falling into white's hands a little bit because it weakens d5, and there's a more solid, the simple knight c6 is sufficient, I would say, in this position for equality, because if d5, the knight can just go back, and then c6 biting, it's fine for black. But this move might be a little bit dubious because of the d5 square. For example, taking bishop g5, trying to weaken black's d5, and you see that the d5 strategy might actually be of some potential significance here. Yeah, with white getting a small edge. It's to be avoided, basically. But black has better against b3. It's not the most deadly move in the world. Yeah, black just plays, as mentioned, not c5, which kind of weakens d5, but knight c6. So as long as the c pawn's here in reserve, then that's better for that d5 structural concern. Especially with the light square bishops exchanged off. The light squares are major interest areas of concern. Okay, so we have here rook a1. The knight actually does go to c4. It can go to b6, and still the c pawn is free to move then. So it's slightly better and more flexible for black to have that position with the knight on b6. Okay, so rook e1. We have rook c8. Potentially it's useful to play c5 and the rook automatically activating. Of course, it does seem to neglect the a file, of course, so maybe you might think a4 is made a little bit more effective at some point. But let's see, h3, white actually plays a waiting move. Sometimes the back row can become weak in variations, so giving the king some air, and black complements white's move with symmetrical reply. b3 now, we do actually see b3 kicking the knight and the fianchetto. So is there going to be pressure on e5, which is of any use? Black in advance supports e5 explicitly now, so offering explicit support for e5. d takes, and now is white trying to use a mixture of e5 and the a file? White plays a4. It seems as though, is white claiming a small edge or not? Just to check out, by the way, the key forcing move in the position, it doesn't really do much here. The trouble with forcing moves in general, sometimes they just give something to the opponent in a lot of cases. In other cases you can win spectacularly, of course, but here there's nothing really to be gained. Knight a2 hitting e5. Black simply has bishop d6. And black's fine. There's no big deal here. If knight b4, just rook a8. Yeah. And with the knight on b6, also, by the way, well, not that a4 is possible, but sometimes b takes, even if the knight wasn't there, because the knight's holding down white's a4 basically. Yeah, it's quite useful now on b takes. So anyway, if we go back to this position, so taking off the queens, it doesn't seem a big deal at all. So we see actually for the moment a4. Black just plays c6 now. So he's ready for a takes b if white does play a takes, just a takes without losing the b5 pawn to the knight. I know it's not mega exciting stuff. There are small concerns to address all the time in these sorts of positions. Now the queens come off, and now a takes b5. So white is perhaps trying to show that there might be some issue with the a file and e5. We have now knight e2 hitting e5. Now a disruptive move is played bishop b4. This is quite interesting, but you know, it is actually possible here after knight e2 to even consider knight takes e4. This is quite interesting, because knight takes e5 is to be avoided. Bishop c5, and look at black's pieces. It's beautiful. This is a beautiful position for black. There's even an exchange sack here possible, leaving black in a great way. Black's actually better here, because he'll be winning back the exchange immediately. So, you know, white has to tread carefully as well. Bishop takes e5 would give bishop d4 in case of bishop c5, and this should be fine. But in any case, the point here is that knight takes e4, and it does seem to leave the pawn hanging, and in fact it can be played just simply knight takes e4 would be good. But this is interesting as well. Bishop b4, disruptive. So clearly c3 would be a poxy looking move, hemming in one's pieces to be avoided. One wants to generally liberate one's pieces and hem in the opponent's. So no, but the self-pin doesn't seem exactly appetizing to go into a self-pin either. Why would you want to do this? Black would just be absolutely fine. So that leaves bishop c3, simplification, getting rid of the dark square bishops. Knight bd7, because rook a6 was a concern, so getting out of the way of rook a6 in advance. Rook a6 now, protecting c6, b4, and this isn't really a major bind on c5 actually. You might think surely c5 is actually impossible because we have knight takes and knight d6. That's even not the case. Black could in fact play c5 here immediately. Black played rook e6. If c5, this is not devastatingly bad for black. After knight takes b5, c takes, knight d6. Can you see the resource black has? If I give you 5 seconds, because black's basically, you know, these two pawns are under scrutiny here, but black also, he's not losing any material. He's got rook e6, hasn't he? And it's fine. It's fine for black. So in fact, c5 was entirely possible. But we see a more sophisticated looking move, rook e6, which implies c5 not minding double pawns. Black wants to expose c2 and potentially e4, make those vulnerable. So c5 is on the cards here. We see now rook b1. c5 now hits the rook on a6 and virtually forcing rook takes e6. Obviously it's not desirable to allow the rook to unleash here against these unprotected bits and pieces here. Rook a7 would be a disaster. C takes b4, double attacking, well, the knight is just a way of losing a pawn basically. That would be absolutely pathetic thing to do. So no, rook takes e6 is virtually forced. Only move, box move, as informative symbols would tell you. Okay, now there's two ways of taking here, and in fact white took with knight takes b5. B takes c5 seems entirely plausible, as well as knight takes b5. let's have a look at, so knight takes b5 is the game continuation, but let's have a quick look at this. Rook takes c5, knight takes b5, the e4 pawn is loose, and although black has the double pawns, this position, this would seem useful to play c4, but essentially it's still virtually equal here. It's nearly completely equal. Okay, yes. So I know it's shocking, but it does seem it does seem b takes c5 is plausible. But anyway, knight takes b5, c takes b4. Black seems to be just getting an active rook, and absolutely fine with this active rook. And there's a touchdown check which can cause disruption because f2 would be unprotected, and that's used here. After knight d6, it looks as though white might want to play rook c4 to get the rooks off to put pressure on e5, but it's no big deal. White's e4 pawn is loose. In any case, black has totally equalized here. He plays a check to get the king away from f2 and just hits f2. White has no real way of getting anything from this position. He just plays king g1, inviting repetition, and they agree a draw here. Yes. not too exciting. Yeah. What else does white do in this position? Yeah, rook c4 has been ruled out. We just take on f2, and there's nothing for white here. And it's not just because of the extra pawn, by the way. You know these are doubled. You might think, well, isn't there any piece play? No, in fact, black has the piece play as well after knight h5 with knight f4 coming. So it's not just about the extra pawn. So there's no way of continuing the game, essentially. King g1 is the most sensible, logical move available. Yes, I don't consider this the most exciting game I've ever seen in my life, but it's what you expect in World Championship games. You know, these super solid, classical fights. And this is another example of such a fight in the classic Ruy Lopez. Okay, comments, questions, likes, appreciated. Thanks very much.